Welcome to the Saving Lives podcast. I'm Eddie Joe. For historical context, today is the 27th of February of 2025. We're going to be discussing a study titled Normosol-R versus lactated ringers in the critically ill, a randomized trial. So for those who don't know, both Normosol as well as lactated ringers are what's considered balanced salt solutions. Normosol tends to be like plasma light. And this paper was published in Chest, and to be exact, it was published on February 8th, 2025. So a little bit over under 20 days ago. As always, this is not medical advice on how to take care of your patients. Hat tip to the authors, read these data for yourself. And if you haven't checked out a copy of my book, the Vasopressor Inotrope Handbook yet, feel free to pick up a copy, save 10% by using the code podcast at checkout on my website, or you could buy it on Amazon. Let's get straight into the study, where from a background perspective, we have to discuss that. Again, both of these are balanced crystalloids, and balanced crystalloid solutions have demonstrated to have better outcomes in patients compared to 0.9% sodium chloride, also called normal saline, in critically ill patients. Now, this is the first time that I see an actual study that's comparing two different types of balanced salt solutions, in this case being Normosol and lactated ringers. Now, the whole debate between looking at Normosol is because as a buffer, Normosol uses acetate as well as gluconate. We could discuss these components ad nauseum. And lactated ringers has lactate, which unfairly, or how could I say this? It causes a lot of concern because people think it's lactic acid, but the reality it's not. From a actual perspective of what's in it, normal salt does have a higher sodium concentration than lactated ringers. It has lower chloride as well as the buffers that I mentioned previously, being both acetate as well as gluconate. And then from the LR perspective, it contains a lower sodium level and lactate as a buffer. So what does this do with regards to acid-base balance as well as organ function and patient outcomes? Well, we don't know. So this is what the study objective here is that they wanted to see how Normosol-R affects plasma bicarb levels, kidney function, and mortality, and if it's different than using lactated ringers in critically ill patients. Now, from a study design perspective, this was a pragmatic, cluster randomized, multiple crossover trial at an academic medical center. So that's a lot of nuance that goes into that. Multiple crossover and all that makes it a little bit more complicated. From a population standpoint, they looked at 2,084 critically ill patients that were admitted to the ICU between June of 2018 and January of 2019. So this was before all the interesting things that happened in critically ill patients around 2020. From an age perspective, these patients were 59 years. That's the median age. 48.3 were female, and they were moderately severely ill with a median SOFA score of 5. Now, from the intervention standpoint, these patients had monthly randomization of ICU fluid to either use Normosol-R or lactated ringers. And then all fluids that were given to these patients, whether it was maintenance fluids or resuscitation fluids, followed the assigned crystalloid. So for that month, they either got the Normosol or they got the lactated ringers. So what were they trying to see? What was the primary outcome here? Obviously, mortality would be very difficult to prove because you need a ton of patients. So they looked at using plasma bicarb concentration over the first 7 days. That was their, again, primary outcome. From a secondary outcome, they wanted to see how these fluids intervened on the kidneys or how they affected the kidneys. So they were looking at renal replacement therapy use. And here's where they threw in the 30-day mortality. And then they also looked at different acid-base parameters, whether it be chloride, sodium, pH, base excess, strong ion difference. Now, here's what you're here for, the results. From an acid-base balance perspective, again, the bicarb concentration, this was the primary outcome. There was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. The mean difference was just 0.12 millimoles per liter. This gave us a p-value of 0.61, I apologize, which is not statistically significant. Now, from other acid-base measures that they did, looking at, for example, plasma chloride level, strong ion difference, or arterial pH, well, there was no difference here either. Now, when you look at the secondary outcomes, which included kidney replacement therapy use, They found that 6% of patients who received the Normosol-R did require new renal replacement therapy. The Lactated Ringers group, this was 5% as opposed to 6, but in reality, this was not statistically significant, so no big difference here. From a mortality standpoint, recall as I said earlier in this podcast, just a few minutes ago, the 30-day mortality would be very hard to find a difference. You'd need tens of thousands of patients, if not even more. And go figure, they found no difference. The mortality in the Normosol-R group was 16.3%, versus in the Lactated Ringers group, it was 16%. Then, obviously, this was not statistically significant. So they also had this other combined outcome called the MAKE-30 major adverse kidney events, which includes death, renal replacement therapy, or renal dysfunction. And again, between the Normosol-R group and the Lactated Ringers, there was no difference. There was 27.4% and 25.3% respectively. So what should we do differently, if anything at all, when we have to choose between these two these two fluids for our patients? Well, we know now that there's no major difference in the acid-base balance between these two, even though they have different buffering agents, being the acetate as well as the gluconate in the Plasmolite/Normosol. I hate saying that, but it's true. They're basically a copy of each other. If I'm wrong, please let me know. And the lactate in the LR, well, there's no difference. Then when you look at hyperchloremia, given that the LR does have a higher chloride load than the Normosol group, well, there was no difference here either. When you look at the renal outcomes for these patients, being the kidney injury, there was no difference between the two. Mortality, obviously, no difference between the two. Now, how does this compare with saline, for example? And this is where we have to check out my previous podcast, where using balanced salt solutions was beneficial to using saline in critically ill patients. This study, of course, was not perfect. I always give a hat tip to the authors, because performing a study like this is a huge pain in the butt, and that's why I don't partake in such things. But we do have to be honest about the limitations. For example, this is a single-center trial, so just one hospital. It might not be generalizable to all ICUs, although I really do think that it is. The other thing is that there's limited fluid volumes. These patients had lower crystalloid administration than some sepsis trials, and it was just a short follow-up, but I really don't think that that's a big deal. Key takeaway here, if you have to choose between balanced salt solutions, whether it be Normosol, Plasmolite, or Lactated Ringers, I would choose any of those over 0.9% saline any day of the week. All in all, I guess that wraps up this podcast episode. If you guys have an idea for what you would like to send me to break down, just feel free to contact me at ejomd@gmail.com, and I'll go through the article and we can talk about it a little bit more. Thanks so much for supporting the program and supporting the podcast. Hope you have a great day, guys. Thanks. Bye.